All right, well, good morning. Certainly good to see everyone out this morning. Thank you for those songs. We're going to be continuing in our series on discipleship. We are in Mark chapter 9. Still doing a little bit of juggling here this morning with the... Appreciate your patience. Of course, one of the dangers of you being better able to hear me is you may not like what I'm saying as much. So I guess we'll just have to run that risk, but hopefully everything is working smoothly. So in our series on discipleship, we are here at Mark chapter 9. We're going to be looking at verses 30 to 37. And the title of this message is The First and the Last. So Mark chapter number 9, beginning with verse number 30. And they departed thence and passed through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it, for he taught his disciples and said unto them, The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him. And after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. But they understood not that saying, and were afraid to ask him. And he came to Capernaum, and being in the house, he asked them what it was that ye disputed among yourselves by the way. But they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves who should be greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and saith unto them, If any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all, and servant of all. And he took a child, and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said unto them, Whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receiveth me. And whosoever shall receive me receiveth not me, but him that sent me. So when Jesus and the three disciples came off of the mountain where there was the transfiguration, they found the other 9 disciples that were surrounded by a crowd and debating some of the scribes, because there was a man that had brought his son to Jesus in order for Jesus to cast a demon out of the boy. Jesus wasn't there, of course. He was up on the mountain with 3 of his disciples. So the man asked the other disciples that were there to help him and to cast this demon out, but they weren't able to do so. Now, the whole episode there centers around the lack of faith. The unclean spirit had caused much suffering for this boy and for his family, and the father details that in this account. But that also portended greater suffering on that generation of Israel because of their lack of faith in Jesus as Messiah. The father also confessed his lack of faith. The 9 disciples also lacked faith, which was evident by their failure in prayer that meant they couldn't cast the spirit out. So their lack of faith indicated their self-reliance. And this failure of the disciples illustrated what Mark has already shown in this gospel, that a lack of faith limits us. Unbelief doesn't limit God in the sense that it renders him incapable of doing something, that it lessens his power or ability. But unbelief does, in fact, limit us. It does limit what we can receive. So now as we come to this next section, Jesus and the disciples are continuing toward Jerusalem, and he predicts his death, and this is the second time that he does so in this gospel and in this particular section that we're looking at. He had just cast this evil spirit out of a boy, and the 9 that were unable to cast him out. So Jesus, he showed that he had great power to speak a command that this spirit had to obey. But once again, that show of power is overshadowed by Jesus telling his disciples he will be killed. So in other words, the disciples see this display of power as the ascendancy of Jesus, the coming of his kingdom that they were looking for. And then this dark shadow comes over again as Jesus says he's going to be killed. He's going to be given into the hands of men, and he's going to be killed. And so what we see is this pattern of failure in the disciples, and it continues here in this account as well. They don't understand what Jesus means. When Jesus talks about being killed and then rising again on the third day, they don't understand what he means, what it is that he's talking about. And then not only that, they're actually arguing with each other about which one of them is the greatest. Now, this leads to some teaching sessions where Jesus instructs the disciples about discipleship with an emphasis on humility and service. So we want to look at this in two parts, verses 30 to 32, where Jesus gives the prediction of his death. And then in verses 33 to 37, where Jesus teaches that being first means being last. So we'll begin in this first part where Jesus predicts his death, verse number 30. And they departed thence and passed through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it. So Jesus left the region of Caesarea Philippi, which is where he was with his disciples when the transfiguration occurred north of there. And they're journeying south now. They're going toward Jerusalem. And they came to this northeastern part of Galilee, and he's beginning to pass through. Now, coming back into Galilee, it tells us that Jesus did not want his location and his movements to be known. Now, this differs a little bit from some of the charges that we have noticed where Jesus charged certain ones that they would not make him known. So back in chapter 8 and verse 26, you had the blind man from Bethsaida that Jesus healed, and then he charged that man not to tell anyone what had happened. After the disciples confessed that Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, he confirms this, and in verse 30 of chapter 8, he charges them not to tell anyone that. And then after the transfiguration in chapter 9 and verse number 9, Jesus charges them not to tell about what happened on the mountain until after he has risen from the dead. Now, this is a little different from those instances. It says here that they were passing through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it. So this charge would be closer to what happened there with the man from Bethsaida. But at this point, Jesus' public ministry of working miracles and even the public teachings that he is engaged in, that part of his ministry is ended. He has now turned toward Jerusalem, and this time for the public displays and such is really past. So his focus has shifted toward his disciples as he moves toward Jerusalem. And we noted previously, as he's on the way to Jerusalem, you have this increase in concentration of the private conversations and teachings that Jesus gives to the disciples. He's obviously focusing on them. He's preparing them for what is to come and what they will need to do afterward. And this preparation and this teaching, this is not for the public in general, but for his disciples. Verse 31, for he taught his disciples and said unto them, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him. And after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. So Mark explains Jesus' desire here that his travels would not be generally known, because he was continuing to instruct his disciples, and particularly in his upcoming death. So he's telling his disciples about what is about to happen, and not too long of a time from when he's telling them this. Notice that he says he's going to be handed over, he's going to be killed, and he's going to rise again the third day. All very similar to his first prediction back in chapter 8 and verse number 31. But Jesus taught here that he would be delivered into the hands of men. That's something he did not say before. Now, the word for delivered is sometimes translated betrayed, and it is used several times in connection with Jesus' death. In other words, it is the word used to describe the betrayal of Judas. Judas was the one who was one of the 12 disciples, the followers of Jesus, who ultimately betrayed him into the hands of the chief priests, and that led to his being arrested and being crucified. So it is used of Judas' betrayal in chapter 14 in 3 or 4 different places. It's also used of Pilate in chapter 15 in verses 1 and 10 of how that Pilate delivered, or how the high priest and the council in Jerusalem delivered Jesus into Pilate's hands. And then it's used of Pilate himself in chapter 15 and verse 15 of Pilate delivering Jesus, handing him over to the soldiers who ultimately were the ones that crucified him. So this word is used in several places in connection with the death of Jesus Christ, emphasizing that he was handed over, that he was delivered over. Now, there could be a little bit of a play on the words here that, in other words, all of these connections have some relevance to what Jesus is saying here, but the emphasis that Jesus gives doesn't seem to be on any of those particular instances. His first prediction back in chapter 8 began with how this must happen. This must happen, that he be rejected and killed and rise again from the dead. This must happen to Jesus as the Christ, which is what had happened just prior to that prediction that Peter confessed that Jesus was the Christ. Jesus said this must happen. Now, what he's referring to, he's referring to the revelation of God's will in the Old Testament scriptures. He's referring to God's plan from before the foundation of the world for his Messiah and the redemption of men. So his first prediction began with what must happen. And here Mark emphasizes that Jesus would be delivered into human hands. He would be delivered into the hands of men. And that's just anthropos in the Greek, just generic word for men, just human beings. He would be delivered into human hands for them to do to him as they would. Well, Paul also wrote of this handing over in Romans chapter 8 and verse number 32 when he said that God, speaking of God the Father, delivered him, Jesus Christ, up for us all, using that same word. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, Paul uses that same word that Mark uses here again, saying that Jesus gave himself up. So the same word is also used in the Septuagint translation. Septuagint being a Greek translation of the original Hebrew Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 53, verses 6 and 12, about God the Father delivering up his servant to death. So there is good connections in the Old and the New Testament to understand that when Jesus talks about that he must be delivered into the hands of men, that his emphasis here is on God delivering him into the hands of men. He will be delivered from there in various ways, as we talked about just a few moments ago, and even that betrayal of Judas is a delivery. But when Jesus predicts his death, again, he's doing so in consistence with God's plan, that this is God's will. This is what must occur to the Messiah. He repeats that he will be killed and that he will rise from the dead on the third day. And again, this is very similar to what he said in chapter 8 and verse number 30. Of course, a part of the reason why Jesus must be killed in this way was in order to atone for the sins of his people, which is also referred to in Isaiah chapter 53 as well as elsewhere. And then in verse 32, Mark adds, "But they," speaking about the 12 disciples, "understood not that saying and were afraid to ask him." So the disciples still don't see clearly. They don't grasp. They are still like that blind man from Bethsaida after his first contact with Jesus, who saw in a very blurry way men like trees walking around. The disciples are much like that. They have a little bit of blurred vision, but they don't really understand what Jesus is saying. Now, on the one hand, the words that Jesus is using are not words that are hard to understand. You know, if I opened up some scientific textbook and began reading it to you, you may not understand, you may not know, be familiar with the terms and the words that are being used. But that's not the case with Jesus' words. He's not using words that the disciples have never encountered before. They don't know what the meaning of the words are. So they hear what he's saying. They get that Jesus is saying that he must be killed and rise from the dead. They've understood that well enough. So on the one hand, perhaps they were thinking that Jesus was just speaking metaphorically, that his words weren't literal, but were more figurative about something that was going to happen to him. And if that's the case, then they weren't able to decipher the meaning. In other words, are they thinking that, this is some sort of code? This is some sort of figure, shadowy language that he's using, and they can't decipher the meaning? Well, it's obvious from the broader context that we've talked about a time or two here in Mark. They were anticipating the coming kingdom from the Old Testament prophecy. They were anticipating that. From Jesus' words and works, they were anticipating that. They did not comprehend, though, how that Jesus' prediction fit with that expectation. He's the Messiah. He's the Christ. He's confirmed that to them. And if that being the case, that means he is the king. He will rule over this messianic kingdom that the prophets wrote about and spoke about. So what could it mean, or how could it be possible that Jesus would be killed? Well, we could also add from what follows, they didn't see how that what Jesus was saying fit with their own plans. Because obviously, they had thoughts about high positions in the kingdom. They expected that Jesus was going to set it up soon, and that they themselves were going to be elevated to high ruling positions within the kingdom. And now Jesus is saying when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to be betrayed and killed. How does that fit with their own plans? Notice that Mark says here, they were too afraid to ask. So I would say that their understanding and their failure to understand and failure to ask about this probably reflects some pride on their part as well. And again, some resistance to Jesus' plan. Jesus has pointed out their lack of understanding, their lack of comprehension on 3 different occasions. And when he was teaching the parables in Mark chapter number 4 and verse 13, when he was teaching or speaking in response to the Pharisees about the washing of hands and about what really defiles a man in chapter 7 and verse 18, and also in regard to the feeding of the multitudes in chapter 8, verses 18 and 21, he pointed out that they were without understanding or without comprehension. And even more recently, he had rebuked Peter for protesting his prediction of his death in chapter 8 and verse number 33. So it seems that they did not want to confess to Jesus their lack of understanding. Well, then we get to the second part, beginning in verse number 33, where Jesus teaches that being first means being last. And he came to Capernaum. And being in the house, he asked them, "What was it that ye disputed among yourselves by the way?" So they're continuing on their way. They're journeying in Galilee, and they've came to this city of Capernaum. Capernaum was a very small town on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Peter and Andrew, we are told, were from Bethsaida, but they were actually living in Capernaum, which was a fishing town, when Jesus called them to follow him as disciples. And Mark talks about that in chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. And Mark notes here that they had come into the house at Capernaum. Now, he doesn't identify this house in particular. It's possible that this was Peter's house there in Capernaum. They had been there before, in fact, when Jesus had healed Peter's mother-in-law back in Mark chapter 1 and verse number 29. So we don't know for sure what house that he was in. Perhaps it was the house of Peter or maybe some other. We just don't know for sure. But once again, the fact that they've come into the house, Jesus and the disciples, is highlighting the fact that this is a private conversation, that Jesus has this interaction with his disciples, and it's of a private nature. So he asked them this question: what were you arguing about on the road? So as they are on the road, so think about this, they have gone to northern part of Caesarea Philippi. Jesus has come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. Now, 3 of them know about that transfiguration, and the other 9 do not. Nevertheless, when they come down, he has shown this great power that he has in commanding this evil spirit out of this boy, something the 9 disciples altogether could not accomplish. And now they're on the way. They're walking. They're moving south. They're coming to Capernaum. And on this road, as they're on the way, they're arguing amongst themselves about which one of them will be the greatest. Now, the word that is used here, it's a word that can mean simply having a discussion, but the context obviously indicates that it was a dispute, and we see that clearly from the next verse as well. So they were clearly disputing, debating, arguing about who would be the greatest. Verse 34, and he sat down and called the 12 and saith unto them, verse 34, but they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. So their reaction to this question also confirms the fact that they were arguing. It wasn't a, well, Jesus, we were having this discussion, and there were a few different points of view, and we'd like to hear what you have to say about it. No, they were arguing with each other about which one of them was going to be the greatest. And when Jesus asked them this directly, they didn't answer him. Obviously, Jesus knew what they were talking about. And it could be another failure of faith that they didn't realize that. So they didn't want to ask what Jesus meant when he talked about dying and rising again. And here they didn't want to admit what they had been arguing about. And Mark explains they had been arguing about which one of them would be the greatest. And he's talking about in the kingdom. It is in the future prospect. Which one of them was going to be the greatest? In other words, Jesus is the Messiah. That means that he is the king. He's going to reign over this Messianic kingdom. He's going to set this kingdom up, which they assumed was going to happen soon. And which one of them in that kingdom was going to be in the greatest, the highest position? Now, Matthew and Luke both make note of the fact that they were arguing about the future kingdom. Mark doesn't say that specifically, but that is, again, from the context, it is clear. So Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ back in chapter 8, verse 32. Jesus was the Messiah, was confirmed by Jesus himself, and then he told them not to tell anyone about it. But that very confession and confirmation that they received seems like it stirred up their excitement for the Messianic kingdom and their place in it. By greatest, who should be greatest? They were concerned about having the highest position in the kingdom behind Jesus the King, of course. I don't believe any of them were thinking that they were going to supplant Jesus on the throne, but just saying, but just below Jesus, just right after him, just next to him, which one of us is going to be the greatest? Of course, later in chapter 10, and we'll get to that later in our study, we know that James and John even become so bold as to request directly from Jesus that one can sit on his right and one sit on his left. In other words, have the two highest positions. They were concerned about being first among men, even among the 12, even among themselves. So in verse 35, it says, and he sat down and called the 12, and saith unto them, If any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all, and servant of all. So Jesus sat down to teach the disciples. It says that he called. It just means that he summoned them to gather around him. And he challenges their desires to be the greatest. And he reveals here another paradox, somewhat like what he said back in chapter 8 and verse 35, that finding your life meant losing it, and losing your life meant finding it. So the one who will truly be great, Jesus says, the one who will be first, who will be greatest, it's not the one with the most knowledge. It's not the one with the most skill in scriptural interpretation. It's not the one with the most credentials. It's not the one with the best genealogy or lineage. But rather, the one who will be first, Jesus says, is the one who is last of all. Last. Not only does he say last, but last of all. The least, the lowest place. Now, when Jesus is talking about first and last, he's talking in terms of rank, or in terms of place, in terms of position. We might say in terms of honor. So when he says that he that will be first must be last, he's talking about not seeing yourself or trying to be ahead of everyone else. The one who truly is first isn't trying to be first. The one who truly is first, he's saying, isn't seeking that, and isn't trying to put others down, so as it were, to be first. It's the one who takes the last or takes the least place. He reinforces this by going on to say, and servant of all. Taking the last place and servant of all. Now here he uses the Greek word diakonos, and is the word which we get our English word deacon from. It's a word that means to serve or to minister. Sometimes it's translated as minister. But it was a word in that day that wasn't a word of nobility, and it wasn't a word of high honor. It was a word that very commonly would describe someone like a table waiter, and maybe even more along the line of someone that was bussing tables, like we would say today. But really it could refer beyond that to just any sort of low-level, menial type of service that was rendered to another. So it is the lowest form of service that can be offered. So this word, Jesus says, must be last of all and must be servant of all. This word diakonos is a word that didn't refer to so much as a position, but as a work, as an activity. Jesus is showing that he's referring here to actions. In other words, being last of all and being servant of all is not about having self-effacing thoughts. It's not about thinking or saying that you are the least. It's not about a show of service like the hypocrites that Jesus condemns in Matthew chapter number 6. They blow the trumpet before they give their alms. They stand in the street and they make long prayers so that everyone can see them. When they are fasting, he says they disfigure them faces. They put on mournful faces. They want everybody to know how much they're suffering and how much they're willingly laying down. Those are hypocritical acts. Those are hypocritical shows of lowliness that don't correspond to what's truly in the heart of those that's doing it. So when Jesus says that he that will be first must be last and servant of all, he's talking about real acts of service, real humility of heart and mind that renders service to another. Oftentimes when we think about service, there are things that we don't want to do or that we dislike to do because oftentimes we feel like it's beneath us. Don't they have somebody for that? Don't they have somebody to do that sort of thing? So it's not about having self-effacing thoughts, but it is about actual humble service that is rendered not only to others, but even to the least of others. And that comes out, verse 36. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said unto them. So Jesus has the disciples all gathered around. Simply says that he took a child. Again, he was in a house. Could have been Peter's house. Could have been Peter's child for all that we know. We don't know for sure that it was or that it wasn't. But he took a child. Now, the word that's used for child here is a word that actually indicates something from an infant to a young child that we might even call a toddler or so. In other words, there is a distinction here between a fuller grown child, a larger and more mature child. So this is definitely talking about a small child, which is we're also seeing by the fact that apparently Jesus picks up the child, then takes the child in his arms. And in verse 37, whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receiveth me. And whosoever shall receive me receiveth not me, but him that sent me. Now you notice that this is similar to some other instances that occur in the Gospels, but it is different. Jesus here does not tell them to be like this little child. Now he does so in other contexts. Here he doesn't tell them to be like this little child, but they are to be receiving of one such as this little child. So Jesus is not using this young child as a way to communicate cuteness or sweetness or innocence or something like that. But rather he is responding. Remember, he's responding to the disciples' desire to be great and their argument amongst themselves about who's better than who and who's going to have the higher position. So Jesus is using this little child as an illustration because in terms of the social construction of the day, a child had zero standing. It had zero standing. And consequently, a child could do absolutely nothing to help the standing of another person. There was simply nothing that child could do for you. Now, obviously, the Bible, he's not talking here about familial love and care for a child. That has nothing to do at all. He's talking about seeking great places. And so here's a child that was close at hand and is representative of the least of these in society. Again, no standing in society. Very, very little of what we might consider rights and such thing that we have all grown up with, maybe become so accustomed to. But very little of that in the case of a child in those days. So to receive such a child means to welcome them, to show kindness to them, to render service to them. Jesus says that receiving of a child was considered in Jesus' name. He received one of such children in my name. Shows that Jesus was using this child to represent the least of his children, particularly of his disciples. Remember, they're arguing with one another. They're followers of Jesus. They're believers in Jesus. And they're arguing with one another about which one of them is the greatest. So this little child represents the least of his children and even these disciples. So rather than arguing with one another, trying to be ahead of one another, they should have been serving one another. It should have been completely different. They should have been a minister, a servant, a diakonos to the other disciples, rather than arguing about position. Furthermore, they should have been servants to the lowliest, and they were not. Jesus said that receiving such a one as this child was receiving him and was also receiving the Father who sent him. In other words, this is the way of faith. This is the way of following Jesus. Not trying to put yourself in the highest position above others, and not seeking those positions the way that class promotion works in the world. So as we think about this account, and again, we are emphasizing discipleship, the following of Jesus, and what that really means, we realize that a preoccupation with position and reward doesn't actually lead to position and reward. How many of us in churches today are guilty of this very same sin? Our doctrine, our baptism, our right way of doing it puts us ahead of everyone else. And we gather on Sunday to thank God that we're not like these other churches. Pastors get in pulpits and pat us on the back, tell us how great we are because we know things nobody else knows. We get it right when everybody else gets it wrong. And we just love being assured that we are the greatest in heaven. Well, this is all completely opposite of what Jesus modeled and taught in his word. This is a Pharisaic pride that needs to be repented of, just like it was with the disciples. So when we're looking at discipleship, we're talking about really following Jesus. We see that pride kills discipleship. Pride completely derails following Jesus. The disciples were blinded. In other words, as we work through these accounts, we see the disciples continuing they lack understanding. They're just not able to grasp what it is that Jesus is saying and what he means. And in part, their blindness is due to their own pride, being preoccupied with which one of them is going to be the greatest and is going to have the highest position and the highest honor and such. Their own agenda had actually taken place of God's agenda. When we're more concerned about rewards and about position and place, we've actually set God's will and God's plan sort of in the background. Well, Jesus modeled a complete submission, a humility, and service, so that the way of following Jesus is denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following him. We must be willing and be servants of all. His commands must be more important to us than our own goals. All right, that's all of the message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.